Hi, everybody. I'm Father Tony, and joining me to talk about the heresiologist is Jonathan Stewart. Hello, Jonathan.
Hello, Father Tony.
How's it going?
Oh, it's going good. Well, as good as it can, life in the Canoma,
That's
but
true. Yeah.
it's actually just a concentrated suffering. But besides that, it's going good right now because we have an amazing show with an amazing guest tonight.
That's right. And our guest tonight is Dr. David Litva, who is joining us to talk about heresiologists and why are they so mean. So welcome, Dr. Litva, and thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
All right.
It's a pleasure to be here.
It's our pleasure to have you. So let's jump right into it. One of the big ones, Hippolytus, wrote a book about heresy and how much he disliked it, The Refutation of all Heresies. Why don't you give us an overview of what that book is about and who Hippolytus was and all that good stuff?
Well, I appreciate you asking that question. That's where we begin. That's where most people begin, with Hippolytus. The book that I published just this year is called The Refutation of all Heresies, and it's traditionally attributed to Hippolytus, but that authorship is wrong. It's disputed, and by most critical scholars now do not attribute it to Hippolytus. Hippolytus, that theory was built up in the late 19th century, and unfortunately it didn't have a lot of evidence. So the first thing to kind of let your viewers know about the Refutation of all Heresies is that we actually don't know who the author is. Now, he was identified with Hippolytus, who is a real dude in the East, supposedly a bishop or some kind of leader of the church, but he was identified with this Roman writer of the Refutation of all Heresies. And the problem with that is it was on very slim evidence. And so today we let the author of the Refutation just be the author of the Refutation and a couple other works. And I follow scholarly practice in not calling him Hippolytus. But that doesn't take away from any of his significance. In fact, this figure in Rome claimed to be the high priest, which is a title that only the bishops of Rome used. So we know that this figure was competing for the chief place in Rome. And in the late 19th century, he was even called Gegenpapst, which means anti-pope. That is the first. We had the first royal duel in the Catholic Church where we had two popes. Now, that's a bit of a misnomer because the papal theology hadn't really developed. What we do have, though, is two figures who claim to be in charge of something called the Universal Church, which is just Katholiki in Greek, the Catholic Church. So he's a major player, he's a major figure, and ironically, we don't know his name. But the Refutation of all Heresies, one of the reasons why we think we don't know his name is because that name was suppressed, because this figure became so dangerous later in church history, and we only have this from one manuscript, that is most of the Refutation of all Heresies, which was found by chance in the mid-19th century in a monastery at Mount Athos, and it is a bad-looking manuscript. They did not take care of this. So it is an absolute blessing that we have this. We're really not supposed to have this, but what's in this book is a loaded cart of all different sorts of meals, so to speak. That is, all different sorts of magic, Gnostic groups, philosophical groups, interesting stories about church politics, and a lot of information that we don't have from anywhere else in Greek, which is in the native language of those Gnostics or whatever we want to call them. They're speaking in Greek, not in translation, so it's not like the Nag Hammadi library. We've got them in their own words. And the author is proud of the fact that he's copied his enemies in their own words because, as he says, he thinks their own words refute them. To us, it's a different story.
Yes, that's common among the heresiologists, right? Irenaeus is renowned for doing that as well, and quoting large passages from the people he doesn't like, saying, "Look at these idiots over here. Can you believe that this is what they're teaching?"
Well, Irenaeus has the reputation of being a kind of chief heresiologist. He's actually, and if you look at book 1 of his Against All Heresies, he doesn't actually quote a lot directly. He's a paraphraser. He describes, people think fairly accurately, what some of these, in this case, Valentinian Gnostic systems look like. The reason why the Refutation of All Heresies is so much different, and I think more important than Irenaeus, is because he actually gives us, in their own words, with very little paraphrase and very little intervention, all of these different groups that we knew nothing about apart from this document.
And about how I find it a fascinating work, and unfortunately, I have your book on order through Interlibrary Loan, and it hasn't come yet. So I read the Shaft translation, which by the way is just a simply dreadful translation. But I hated reading it, but I still loved it because it's such a fascinating work.
Right.
How many groups approximately does he cover in the book?
Well, he covers, I believe it's at least 24 separate groups or thinkers. But what's really exciting about this group is he gives us what's called in German the Gnostic Sondergut. That is eight blocks of material from groups and thinkers that we never knew existed. And again, it's in their own words. And he's very precise about the works that these are coming from. And so the great thing about the Refutation of All Heresies is that it brings us the Gnostic voice in their own voice. And it's stuff that we get nowhere else.
Yeah. Earlier you said that this is a book we're not supposed to be reading. It's been forgotten for a reason, and we just had the one manuscript. Is your theory because that the author was this mover and shaker and was having these problems with the communities at the time, or does it have to do with the content because it's described in such detail and so well, even though he's saying these are bad things and these are silly, were people not copying it and distributing it because they were worrying that people would read this and become fascinated, interested in it? Why do you think that this text was mostly forgotten and not copied or distributed?
Well, it's a great question, and I think it's a mix of both. To be precise, we do have 5 copies of Book 1, which is a kind of philosophical summary. But the real dangerous material, Books 4 through 10, we only have 1 manuscript, very few fragments. And what I think, if I can give my own kind of theory, went on is in Book 9, it is a very entertaining, very, very fascinating, but utterly destructive bombast against the current Bishop of Rome, who was named Callistus. And what our author does in the Refutation is he takes apart Callistus morally, ethically, economically, and destroys him. It is the most gruesome character sketch of any figure known to be a pope, I think, in all of ancient writings. And so this book, which was Book 9, I think really became dangerous to be copied by anyone who, after this author, wanted to be part of or a member of what was called the Universal or Katholiki Ecclesia, the Universal Church. And so, yes, it was dangerous. And yes, the author does warn people reading the book that he's copying out this material in order to destroy his enemies. But he says that, and particularly to the young, he says, listen, I don't want you to be taken in by what they're actually saying. I want you to listen to me. but he gives their own words, which he thinks are self-refuting, but they're not.
Yeah. So let's move on from Refutation of all heresies. Let's talk about briefly some of the other works of the heresy hunters of the early church. What can you tell us about, really briefly, as briefly as you can, somebody like Tertullian, Origen, and Irenaeus?
So all of these thinkers are united by a common ploy, I guess, or a common argument, and that is that they're Christian enemies, and most of the Gnostics they were dealing with were fellow Christians. The argument that they all pull in common, the Refutation very much so, starting this pattern, the argument is that the Christian enemies, so-called Gnostics, are pulling information from mystery cults and philosophical groups and magical practitioners, and that from this material they are developing their form of Christianity. In other words, it's an argument which tries to poison the well, so to speak, and say that, hey, yeah, there's some interesting, enticing stuff in what they're saying, but actually their content is from these evil sources, again, philosophers and mystery cults and magical practitioners. And the author of the Refutation adds astrology to that. Now, what's interesting is, as an argument, this is actually, some people in the ancient world, some people in the modern world actually find this convincing. What seems to be the case is that early Christians were pulling anywhere and everywhere in order to make their teaching and spirituality persuasive. And what we see in these Gnostic writers are just some of the most explorative and open-minded Christians that we've ever seen.
So in other words, their syncretism is bad, but ours is okay, so...
Yeah, basically. I mean, even calling it syncretism, it is a bit of a loaded term that heresiologists could use in terms of, that mixing things together is bad. But in fact, as you're right, that's what we all do. We're all hybrids, so to speak, in our way we think about faith and spirituality. And some of us just misrecognize that.
Sure. All right. Let's draw a line there and get into some more detail in the podcast version. We got a lot more questions, but I don't want to start a new one and run out of time here. So, thank you once again, David Litva, for joining us on the show, and Virginia Tech, Department of Religious Studies. I don't have that in front of me, unfortunately, the specifics, but it's been on the screen a couple of times, so you can go back. Where would you like to send people if they want to find out more about you and your work on the internet?
So I do have a blog. It's just mdavidlitwa at WordPress, and they can find out more information about some of my books and research. All
right, fantastic. So thank you again, and please stick around, everybody, for a couple of days for the podcast, which will come out a few days from the release of this video.